Hello everyone, and welcome back to episode 2 of Checkmate Atun-Shei, the series where I analyze Atun-Shei's infamous series, Checkmate Lincolnites, and determine the veracity of the claims being made. In the previous episode, I addressed many of the general problems with Atun-Shei's presentation style, and how this can be used as a means of trying to subvert and control the viewpoints being presented. I have also pointed out the issue with the comments being selected, the general tone of the comments, and how they can be manipulated to formulate the arguments he wishes to present. In this episode, however, we can see a notable change from the first. More specifically, it actually seeks to address a specific position. This episode is titled, Did Confederate Soldiers Fight for Slavery? Based on the title alone, without having to view the video, I can safely answer the question with one simple statement. It is complex. Did some fight for slavery? Yes. Did some not fight for slavery? Also, yes. The entire issue with this question is there can never truly be a straightforward answer, as this would require understanding the motive of every single soldier in the entire Confederate Army. All 1 million men who served for the Confederacy at some point. To put this into context, roughly 50% of the entire free white male population of the southern states served in the Confederate Army at some point during the war, from boys as young as 14 years old to old men well past their prime, edging up into their 50s. This was a vast range of people, ranging from first family members whose ancestors founded the country, to Scottish settlers up in Appalachia, to the Cherokee and Creek tribes in North Carolina and in the Indian Territory, to the large numbers of first-generation Irish and German immigrants who settled in the major southern cities. As a result, no one brush can be painted across them, nor one singular cause can be attributed to them, as all of their motivations and interests cannot be fathomed by any one individual, let alone someone like Atun-Shei. It would simply be unfair to try to paint them all as fighting for one cause, right? And yet, here we are, about ready to see someone do exactly that. So, let us begin, shall we? The opening for this episode begins with referencing Atun-Shei's previous episode, where, being compelled by the demon likely possessing his body, he viciously murdered Johnny Reb in cold blood. At the same time, he vainly tries to pass this off as some form of entertainment, as if this is somehow funny or something, you know? I'm already getting bored of this, and we haven't even passed the 30-second mark of the video. Not only is his sense of humor absolutely dry, but it amounts to being the equivalent of anti-comedy. He is so unfunny, there's actually a void of entertainment around him, bringing about untold misery and pain for those who seek to criticize him. In fact, I feel confident enough that I could make a more entertaining video with bare minimum video editing skills, cheap and cheesy voice acting from myself, and the power of free photo editing software. So, let me introduce you all to the two characters I wish to bring into the fold. Mr. Nini?
Yes!
Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Yes, I'm Mr. Lily, and I like ketamine.
All right. Mr. Cow?
Top of the morning to you, Mr. Boots.
Would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Mr. Cow O'Cullen, of the clan O'Cullen. I'm an Irish cow, as you can tell. Oh, by the way, I'm totally not a member of the Weary.
So, you two, I'd like for you to give your insight on the first 3 minutes of this video, and you tell me if you think you two could do a better job at being funny. Okay?
Yes, sir, Mr. Boots. Okay.
Are you two ready to enter the Cringe Zone?
It can't possibly be that bad, can it? Yeah, the Cringe Zone. Yeah, woo. All right, let's continue.
Program where we stoutly defend the South against those who would besmirch her. Like the brave boys at Fredericksburg, we shall stand for... Fredericksburg! Oh, sorry. Too soon, I guess. Sir, I have invited you here because you have called the excellent film Gods and Generals a piece of propaganda. It is propaganda. No, it's not, and I say that as a Latino. It's just like Gettysburg. It doesn't have bias approach. It's respectful to both sides. So do us a favor and shut up. Come on, man, you're making this so easy. Give me some of the challenging comments, you know? Bring out the big guns. It's okay, I can take it.
Wow! He's talking about bringing out the big guns. He doesn't even look like he has any guns. Shh, Mr. Nini, it might get interesting.
It's funny. When snot-nosed, green behind the ear, force-fed warm bullshit college boys such as yourself just regurgitate all the totally false narratives you learn. You, sir, are a syphilis-infested crotch goblin and deserve to be eaten alive by pygmy ants. God save the South!
Wait a second. That's it? I'm disappointed in him. The comment was 10 times funnier than him. It's also worth noting he's the one selecting the comments. He's simply cherry-picking the examples he wants to respond to rather than actually, addressing any valid points. Wow! What a dum-dum! Your boots! Play the video.
You know what? That's actually completely true. Gods and Generals is a historically accurate film. You're just angry because it isn't a communist, leftist, anti-Southern propaganda film. You leftist scum try to rewrite history to fit into your anti-American narrative. So criticizing the Confederacy is anti-American. Yes.
I want your honest opinion on this one, Boots. Honestly, yes. It is anti-American. What Atun-Shei and most people of his nature forget is reconciliation. This was a point elaborated on by the late historian Shelby Foote, in which, in the late 19th and early 20th century, a great compromise was made in the historical narrative of the war. It allowed for the toleration of the veneration of Southern leaders, such as Robert E. Lee, and recognized the noble deeds of the Southern men on the federal level. I partially touched upon this in episode 2 of my Layman's Guide to Headstones series. More specifically, the federal government furnishes headstones for Confederate veterans and Confederate troops killed during the war. Oh, keep going, I'm interested. This all began with the Spanish-American War, which saw at least 4 former Confederate generals take up leadership roles during the conflict, the 2 most famous examples being Fitzhugh Lee and Joseph Wheeler. On a side note, several of Fitzhugh Lee's sons became high-ranking Army officers, and one of his grandsons, Fitzhugh Lee III, would go on to serve as captain of the escort carrier USS Manila Bay during the Battle off Samar. Joseph Wheeler actually served with Theodore Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War, and would go on to serve during the Philippine-American War before his health declined, to the point of forcing him into retirement. There are surviving letters between him and Theodore Roosevelt when the latter became president, which, during his presidency, saw major landmarks and reconciliation occur, such as the return of Confederate battle flags to their respective states by the federal government. So, what you're saying is the Confederate veterans were seen as fellow countrymen again? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And how come Atun-Shei doesn't see it that way? Well, times have changed, unfortunately. People seek to destroy the legacy of these men. It honestly upsets me. Ah, I'm sorry to hear that. Let's continue.
Okay, well, my question that I have for you, sir, is what planet are you living on? Gods and Generals isn't just historically inaccurate and horribly offensive, it also does a terrible job of simply representing humanity. Nobody could be that perfect and flawless and pious and awesome all of the time. You know what movie I want to see? I want to see a movie that has a scene where Stonewall Jackson sits on the toilet and takes a huge crap. That's humanity.
Hey, I haven't heard from Mr. Nini yet. I wonder what he's... Mr. Nini! Wait! Oh, I fell asleep listening to this dum-dum! Well, I want to ask you something. What would you consider to be humanity? Well, I think humanity is showing emotion and not being a cold, callous, uncaring, careless, and compassionate, careless weenie. You just said callous twice. Nuh-uh! Do you think someone defecating is, showing off humanity? What? This dum-dum thinks pooping is showing off humanity? What? Yes. No wonder why he's so boring. He has the personality of a poop stain on my hoof. Now, Nini, don't be so mean. I've watched this, Boots. He only gets worse. Okay. Moving on, then.
How dare you speak of the general releasing his bowels? This perspective is so biased. Yes, slavery was in the mix, but South really complex. And not ever Southern Red fought for slavery. Hell, even Confederate generals were against the practice. So do a big homeworks on it. That's a lie. Most Confederate generals absolutely approved of slavery, and your average Confederate soldier knowingly fought to preserve it. No, they didn't. Yes, they did. No, they didn't. Yes, they did. No, they did not. 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 No, yes, they did not. They did not. They did not. Yes, they did. No, they did not. So they did not. So yes, they did. Yes, they did. No.
Hey, Mr. Cow, Mr. Nini, is everything all... Oh. Bro, that was so funny, I died from cringe. It was so funny I forgot to laugh. It also died from cringe. Aight, Mr. Cow, I'ma head out. Catch you on the flip side, Bootsy. Bootsy? What?
Well, I can't blame them for dying from the level of cringe on display. The first 3 minutes of this was an absolute bore. It offers little to nothing of value to the overall video outside of being horrendously cringeworthy. The comments selected are at the absolute bottom of the pile, yet they were the only things that got any rise out of me. Unlike Atun-Shei, they were actually funny, if not meant to be deliberately funny. This is made all the more ironic when you consider he uses entertainment as an excuse for his rubbish opinions. This isn't entertainment, it's absolute trite, garbage of the highest order. However, after wasting exactly 3 minutes of my life with his horrid attempts at humor, we finally begin getting into the meat of the video. He responds to the following comment, which I presented here. Much like any other comments he has presented so far, it's poorly worded, but absolutely correct. Why would anyone want to fight for an institution, especially when they had little to no engagement in it and had far more pressing issues to worry about? After all, for a small-time farmer living in Virginia, the main motivation for joining the army would have been the rather obvious fact that the armies would be marching through their lands and would pose a threat to everyone they knew, from their wife to their children to their fathers and mothers that would have lived with them. This would have been a far more pressing matter than any love for an institution, right? And yet, according to him, this position is based from a modern perspective and is rooted in hindsight. He argues that we need to drop the pretense of hindsight for a moment to view it from their perspective. I wonder if he will fully go through with this himself or not. At the same time, he is rapid-firing all of these comments and his responses rather than giving the audience time to process what is being stated. This, of course, makes it all the more frustrating to actually respond to his points as he goes through so quickly that you don't have time to properly process what is being said. The following comment is one that, again, is somewhat of a weak statement, though is making an argument that is commonplace within the Southern mindset. There was, and still is, an ethos among the common Southern population that they were wronged by their leaders, particularly their political leadership who led them into a civil war. In fact, Shelby Foote used the statement, "a rich man's war, a poor man's fight," to describe the conflict, echoing the sentiment of thousands of men who fought during the war and saw the carnage it wrought while the wealthy and powerful seemingly got away with everything. The affluent still remained affluent throughout the South, while the poor were forced into abject poverty in the post-war years. This isn't merely conjured up as a narrative, but is an echoing of a legitimate sentiment that was doubtlessly held by many wronged by the war. In response to this, he shows some pop-ups of some of the books he is likely referencing in order to make his argumentation for why they were fighting for slavery. For the sake of convenience, we will look at the description of the first book mentioned, Marching Masters, Slavery, Race, and the Confederate Army During the Civil War. Using the Amazon brief description, we get the following statement. The Confederate Army went to war to defend a nation of slaveholding states, and although men rushed to recruiting stations for many reasons, they understood that the fundamental political issue at stake in the conflict was the future of slavery. Most Confederate soldiers were not slaveholders themselves, but they were products of the largest and most prosperous slaveholding civilization the world had ever seen, and they sought to maintain clear divisions between black and white, master and servant, free and slave. What makes this ironic is the description for this book has to admit that there were many reasons for why men fought and that many did not own slaves to begin with. To add to this, the following line is stated in the description. By following rebel troops' continued adherence to notions of white supremacy into the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras, the book carries the story beyond the Confederacy's surrender. All of this reads no differently than any other postmodernist interpretation of historical events. For all the attesting to wanting to hone in on their perspective, the work here is likely oriented on a modern interpretation of their views. I cannot say for certain what the book is like as I haven't read it, though, based on this description, it might need to be taken with a grain of salt. The second work, Why Confederates Fought, doesn't make much of a case about what specific causes the Southern men were fighting for, though it does offer home and family as one reason for their motivation. It also adds that reasons can change throughout the war, meaning that pinning any one reason might not be the best idea. The third book, The Origin of Pro-Slavery Christianity, isn't even focused on the reasons for why they fought, but is focused on the complex relationship between blacks and whites within Southern congregations and how those interactions shaped the view of a pro-slavery Christian faith. This appears to have little relevance to the question of why did these men fight, unless if you wish to extrapolate that caring about the safety and well-being of members of your congregation, including those who were enslaved, is somehow defending slavery. That, of course, would be a bit of a stretch. It also bears mentioning that the author of this work stated the following in a commentary on his book. Indeed, sometimes the most important subjects, black Virginians, did not articulate much of anything in the historical record. While slave narratives and church records provide some clear black voices, I occasionally had to resort to familiar strategies of raiding against the grain in white sources or putting together numbers of other testimony to reconstitute the actions of black Virginians. I mention this because many modern scholars often rely upon extrapolating causation and meaning from the work, which can and does affect the views we have on these events. This often happens unintentionally, and does occur accidentally, but it can also be done deliberately to paint a particular narrative. I may pick this book up, if only to see what it has to say and find some more primary sources through it. The fourth and final book referenced, Modernizing a Slave Economy, The Economic Vision of a Confederate Nation by John Majewski, is less about slavery and more oriented around explaining the economic views of the South and how the South felt hampered by the North and the federal government's investment on Northern industry. It is not likely to be a good source for understanding why the soldiers fought. However, in spite of him using sources that make me raise my eyebrow, some considerably more than others, he does at least mention that there were men who fought for other reasons outside of slavery, only to then contradict himself and insist that they were still fighting for slavery. How, you may ask? His argumentation is that they believed that preserving slavery was in the best interest of the Confederacy, which he supports with nothing, actually. He doesn't quote anything from these books, nor does he provide proper accounts to affirm this position. However, unlike him, I do have at least one source I can refer to, an account from Julius Howell, who, well into his 90s, recounted the following about why they fought.
Now, comes up the question of what we Southern soldiers fought for. My friends, as a boy of 16 and a half years old, I didn't think about any abolition of slavery. My mind wasn't developed enough to take in what the politicians had in mind, and hence there was no trouble as to the freedom of the slaves. About half of the negroes, of my father's negroes, left and went to Norfolk to be under, as they considered, protection, but another half, 40, 50 of them, remained and cultivated the crops until after the war. The South did not fight for the preservation or extension of slavery. General Lee, as is well known, was making arrangements to free his negroes, and his father-in-law had already drawn up a part of his will, free his negroes. My friend, it was a great curse on this country that we had slavery, and I thank God that I did not bring up my boys and girls under a system of slavery under which I was brought under. What did you boys fight for then? Here's what a great many people do not know. That as a young man that way I couldn't understand it fully. But I look back now and see my part in it and saw what we struggled for, and that was for states' rights. For states' rights. And as many of you know, immediately after the war, the rights of the various states, well, especially in the South, were very much curtailed, if I may use that word. And since then, I have noticed, you let things come up that encroach on the ordinary states' rights, which we have preserved, and we find that the North, the boys that wore the blue, are with us in preservation of the states' rights.
I wish to present this account in particular not because it refutes the notion of slavery being a reason for why some men fought, but because Atun-Shei would never dare show accounts like this that contradict the narrative he is trying to present. For any account he uses, there are likely many others that contradict his argument that exist, which he deliberately glosses over to construct his narrative. In fact, the entire issue with this video boils down to him ignoring the complex nature of the main question this video is seeking to answer. Rather, he is trying to gaslight the audience into believing what he wants them to believe. Before he even begins to cover any such accounts, he discusses an interesting point, which I believe is worth discussing. He mentions the situation of servile insurrection, in which he describes how emancipation would lead to what effectively amounts to a form of racial warfare between the emancipated slaves and the white population. What he neglects to mention is that the underlying fear of servile insurrection is not an irrational fear, something he later claims in the video, but is actually one based on solid fact. In Haiti, for instance, there was a major slave revolt, which resulted in the independence of the colony, as well as the slaughter of thousands of white people living within Haiti during the time. There were also the much-loathed slave revolts, which I discussed in part during my Raid of Harper's Ferry video by providing an example of Nat Turner's revolt. These affairs were horrific affairs, resulting in bloodshed of countless numbers of people of all ages, including babies. As a result, the fear that Lincoln's emancipation of the slaves in the southern states outside of the Union's control would lead to further violence and cruelty of unimaginable scale was a perfectly rational assumption, one that was only affirmed only 4 years prior with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So, from their perspective, something that Atun-Shei seemingly forgot, this was a real, tangible fear. After this, he mindlessly states, men of the Army of Northern Virginia were 40% more likely to own slaves than the average population. Not only does this come out of left field, but it begs the question, what's the average percentage? Atun-Shei said 30% in the first video. I found one that stated less than 24%, with figures stating the overwhelming majority of that 24% owned between 1 to 9 slaves. If we are to assume either one of those figures, that would still constitute that between 55% and 65% of the Army of Northern Virginia still did not own slaves. That, of course, assumes we take this statistic at face value. Yet, this falls completely apart when you consider that many of the men fighting would have been youths between 18 and 24 years old, meaning that they would have not likely owned any slaves themselves. Instead, they may have come from families that did own slaves, but they themselves never did. Men like John Toomer Young, Albert Polk Brown and his brother, Lycurgus, John W. Pennington, Zechariah Israel, Cornelius H. Oakey, Edwin Jemison, and many others were simply young men who went to war and never made it back. It would be wrong to ascribe any motive, for we can never know what they truly thought. All that remains are their faces and their names. After bringing this random statistic up, he asks, "Don't you think this is a little telling?" Yes, I do, in fact, think this is a little telling. It's telling that you really are a hypocritical person when it comes to those claims of perspective and humanity that you claimed earlier on in the video. Yet, I'm not the one speaking for myself here. Instead, who is speaking for my position is the straw man, Johnny Reb, who decides to deflect from the argument rather than confronting it, talking about Lincoln and how he did not want to free the slaves. He then insists that we're talking about your great-grandpappy to Johnny Reb, which, when you remember that Johnny Reb is meant to stand in for anyone who doesn't agree with him, is denigrating. He then takes an excerpt from the diary of Frank Myers, a cavalryman. He doesn't elaborate on who it might be, but, based on the name and the fact his account survived, it's more likely than not coming from the diary of Benjamin Franklin McIntosh Myers, otherwise known as Frank Myers, captain of Company A of the 35th Virginia Cavalry Battalion. According to his Find a Grave, he was born on October 16, 1840, meaning that he was only 20 years old when the war began. Frank survived the war and went on to write a history of his unit, which was published in 1871, passing away in 1906 at the age of 66 years old. The diary entry he references was written in 1867, 2 years after the war was over. In it, he expresses a deep sense of bitterness and anger, but what is neglected was this bitterness came about because of 4 years of war and living 2 years in Reconstruction-era Virginia. He would have seen the deaths of countless men, many of whom he would have considered his brothers. He would have seen his homeland, Virginia, laid to waste by the war. He would have seen and witnessed the absolute carnage of death and destruction the war had brought, and witnessed the radical Republicans come to the South to actively punish them for a war many did not want. If we put this into its proper context, we can understand why Frank Myers was such a bitter, angry soul. A young man, having his innocence robbed by the horrors of war and the subsequent abuses by the government who hated his guts, would be understandably hateful and angry. Anyone in that position would end up feeling the inklings of hatred and vitriol creep up and attempt to manifest themselves. I don't feel hatred towards this young soul. I feel pity and sorrow for everything he had endured. And yet, Atun-Shei comes to the conclusion that they didn't feel white anymore. He completely and utterly misses the entire point of the statement by getting caught up on what is, rather obviously, an analogy. What Myers was saying was he did not feel any sense of honor anymore, because he had taken up an oath to a country he did not support. It isn't that he didn't feel white, but he felt that everything had been robbed from him by men he saw as his enemies. He then takes a quote from Private Joseph Maid's journal concerning the matter of admitting blacks into the army. The view presented was not merely typical of the South, it was typical of the entire country at the time, including the North. For example, we only need to look at William Tecumseh Sherman's thoughts on admitting blacks into the Union Army, and we find something more verbose. One that I cannot repeat without having to blur out the entire quotation. There was simply a general attitude of the black population being inferior to the white population as a universal basis. The fact he had to clutch this journal, something that can be easily refuted with read Sherman's opinions on black people, speaks volumes on how weak the argument actually is. The third example he cites comes from James Longstreet's speech to some of his men, which, when placing it into the context of the time period, is a rational statement. When referencing that Benjamin Butler does not care for the blood of babes nor carnage of innocent women, what comes up automatically is Nat Turner's Revolt, where the lives of innocent women and children were taken in the most graphic, violent fashion possible. What James Longstreet was echoing was, again, a completely rational and honest fear that all Southerners would have held when emancipation was brought up. And yet, Atun-Shei conveniently ignores perspective and context when describing these things. Why does he do this? Well, he goes on to state, well, how silly must it have felt when the 13th Amendment had been passed and that didn't happen? It was a doomsday prophecy that didn't happen! I have an answer, and it's mind-numbingly simple. The South was occupied by hundreds of thousands of federal troops, which had already freed all of the slaves in the rebelling states by the time of the passage of the 13th Amendment. The reason why servile insurrection on the scale they feared did not take place was because the South had already spent all of its men during a horrible, bloody civil war, and that most of the slaves in the South were freed by military force and coercion. By the time of the passage of the 13th Amendment, the only slaves left were in the border states like Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri, which likely still had considerable numbers of troops sitting around to ensure it was enacted. As a result, it didn't happen. Upon first hearing, this argument made my brain cells feel like they were committing a serious game of Sudoku. It's such a mind-bogglingly dumb argument that it leaves me questioning how anyone could take this man seriously. This also shows that Atun-Shei isn't even applying his own principle of perspective upon the South by taking into account all of the horrific atrocities that had taken place when servile insurrections, i.e. slave revolts, took place. His inability to practice the very principle he just preached minutes ago boggles the mind. He then goes on to argue that it was the South trying to justify the war, still insisting that the war was about slavery, but that the South wanted to change the meaning to make it mean something. This is nothing more than an appeal to the lost cause narrative crafting conspiracy, which simply doesn't take into account that everyone seeks to justify the horrendous atrocities committed during any war at any point in history. This leads me to an important point about the causes of a war. In the case of the slavery argumentation, those who seemingly promote it the most cannot fathom the idea of there being any other reason for why the South would have seceded outside of slavery. This viewpoint, this entire form of argumentation, is built upon a fallacy, the complex cause fallacy to be specific. This fallacy's modus operandi is centered on a complex situation being boiled down to one singular issue that can simply explain everything, often de-emphasizing any and all other issues that may play a role. In the case of the Civil War debate, the most common example is the entire reduction of the complex series of events down to slavery and no other issue, ignoring the deep underlying divisions between North and South that existed outside of, and regardless of, slavery's existence or lack thereof. This specific form of the complex cause fallacy is one that I have chosen to call reductio ad servitutum, or reduction to slavery. For any future examples of this, I will be utilizing this term as it encapsulates the fallacious nature of the argumentation and its use to shut down any form of debate on the matter. After all of this, we finally approach the end, and, well, I think it's better for you to watch than for me to explain.
Look, I know it's hard to hear that your great-grandpappy was all in for slave labor. It's a bummer, even taking into account his reasons for believing that, and to him, they were good reasons. You don't want to think of him that way. You want to think of him as this heroic defender of hearth and home, not as an enthusiastic foot soldier in the slaver's army. But the truth is, he was both. He was a complicated, flawed human being, just like you or me. Now all the great-grandpappies are in the ground, and they've been moldering there for more than 100 years. If you could go back in time and meet them, their beliefs would have horrified you. These long-dead racists are not your friends. You have nothing in common with them. What they stood for was evil, and everybody seems to know it, but you.
And until you guys reconcile that fact, you really shouldn't be surprised that you're being criticized.
This is insulting. The fact he talks directly into the camera, looks directly at the audience, to say these vile things leaves me no doubt as to the intention of this entire video. The entire video is nothing more than a vain attempt to shame people into hating themselves for even having an ancestor who fought for the Confederacy. Atun-Shei has no way of knowing who my ancestors were, what they were like, and passing judgment upon them. No living person has the right to pass judgment upon those who cannot speak for themselves. That is why it is a taboo in virtually every single civilized society on the planet, including the West, to pass judgment upon the dead. In this, I see Atun-Shei no differently to Pope Stephen VI, placing the corpse of Pope Formosus on trial. This video is nothing more than his corpse synod, one directed squarely at your ancestors and my ancestors. I know for a fact he does not know what was on the mind of every single soldier during the war, particularly that of several of my ancestors who fought during the war. One of my ancestors died at the age of 26, leaving behind several young kids, including a daughter, without a father. He was killed at Chancellorsville and was buried in an unknown grave, lost to time. This entire video, its entire purpose for existing, is to shame the audience. Don't let this devious, no-good doer convince you to be ashamed. Think for yourself and realize that what he's saying is deceitful, that he's actively lying to you about your ancestors. In conclusion, Episode 2 is nothing more than a contrived, rapid-fire mess that doesn't sway my opinion over much. However, what it does that the previous episode did was directly insult me and anyone else who even so much as shows respect towards the dead. His disrespect is immeasurable, and I am deeply disappointed in him. I'd like to thank everyone who's watched this video, and on a final note, I want to just say God bless those souls who have passed on, and may God bless all of you.